All right. So here's another question. Can I get a pre-approval from a lender before making an offer on an assumption?
You want to tackle this one first, Randy?
Yeah. So the simple answer is yes. I actually do recommend it that you do get pre-approved with a lender, even if you're going to go the assumption route. One, if you're going to submit an offer on a property, in most cases, that property is probably going to be represented by an agent. That agent is going to probably ask you, hey, my seller would like to know if you've already spoken to any lender and what are you approved for, right? Based on today's rates. If you said no, that I haven't spoken to any lender, that is a concern potentially for the seller and the agent that you might not even qualify for the seller's loan. So my recommendation always is get pre-approved based on today's rates, just so you know where you fall. And the good news is that if you're going to take over an assumable loan, that interest rate should be a lot lower. So you should have no problem then qualifying for that loan with their lender servicing company that's going to have to pre-approve you. So you should do it, period. That's my quick answer too. Yes.
Okay, so thank you for that information. What about the role then of backup financing in an assumption? I would assume that in addition to being, a good idea to show to the listing agent and the seller, it could also serve as a backup, correct? In case the assumption doesn't work out for some reason and you still love the house.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that I would like our clients or buyers to do when they speak to our lenders is I always say, hey, when you speak to the lender, ask them to give you a scenario. What would this same loan look like based on whatever your budget is per month? What would that same loan look like potentially if the interest rates were lower by 0.5%? Also, then ask the same lender, what would that monthly payment look like if the interest rate was lower by 1%, right? Because then it gives you different scenarios to look at as a consumer and say, okay, so if I buy with today's rate, I can afford up to this amount based on my monthly budget. But if rates happen to drop, which they have dropped 0.5% within the last month, okay? Imagine you talked to that lender a month ago, and now all of a sudden, here we are. Rates are lower by 0.5%. You already have that scenario, and you know that you can either A, stay within that purchase price, which would mean your monthly payment goes down because of a lower interest rate, or you can increase your purchase power, right? And maintain the monthly budget you want on the payment. And imagine if you then work with a good agent and they negotiate a seller credit for you, right? That you can then use to buy down the rate further. And all of a sudden you find yourself now not at a 6% rate, but now at a 5% rate traditionally. That could actually make more sense. And guess what? You already have that scenario from your lender if you follow my advice, right? So you know exactly what that would look like and how much purchasing power are you now able to increase, right? Or how much you can save on your monthly payment. It's your decision. But ultimately, it just gives you options to consider and not lock yourself in a box of doing the assumption only. Because the reality is, if you actually have to borrow the secondary financing, which is now going to be a lot easier, like I mentioned, in previous trainings, we mentioned that rate is going to be higher, anywhere between 2 to 3 points higher. So if the interest rate is 6, secondary financing might be 8%. And if you're assuming a loan and that rate is 3%, but you're getting a secondary financing for $200,000 at 8%, and you have a blended rate and a blended payment, that math might not pencil for you, right? It actually might make more sense for you to go through the traditional route, use your VA financing if you're a VA buyer, not have to bring any gap, 100% finance it, and you might be able to get a property and a loan at a 5% rate, the traditional route, right? So that's why it's really good idea to always have open dialogue with a lender so you can look at all types of options and not be kind of confined only to an assumption.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
I would also say, the factor to consider is, a lot of people buying a home have to make a decision what matters more. does the payment matter more, which payment matters a lot, obviously,
Yeah.
or is it just the perfect house?
Yeah.
Right. And if you're looking at the assumption, and I don't know, we've seen scenarios where it's only for an entitlement swap and a VA deal, and somebody doesn't have sufficient entitlement to do a swap, and they can't do the assumption. Maybe they likely qualify for the assumption if they're going to qualify for backup financing, but they might have to say, you know what, this is the house I want to raise my family in, and I'm going to switch to regular financing. We have seen a few deals where, it's going through the assumption and people have run a concurrent backup financing loan to say, if this didn't get worked out right, and now these were more in the early days when this was sort of shaking out as to a viable option, but people were like, this is the house no matter what. If I can get the lower payment, yes, I'm going after it, but I'm not going to lose the house. I'll close on it either way, right? And so that's, I think, the best rule for knowing your backup financing options. Now, if it's all about payment and you can't get that assumption done, then there's not really a role for backup financing that I see. So,
Yeah. Love that. Good idea. I love the concurrent, to do it all at the same time, because if the servicer takes too long to get your assumption approved, some sellers might be like, hey, I have to sell by this date, or we need to cancel. You can then go the other direction if you're comfortable with what that payment would look like, right? So
right.
I love that, running it at the same time. So.
All right, very good. So then, Craig, how can pre-vetting with your company Assumption Solutions fill a gap in the assumption versus the new loan process?
Right. So, Randy talked about talking to your lender up front, but a lot of lenders are kind of resistant to getting involved with people who are primarily looking to do an assumption, because there's really not an income stream for them in that environment. And so where we were getting involved is primarily when deals were put together, buyer and seller had already been in the contract, and we saw a need where buyers were like, well, I want to do an assumption, but what is my range of what I need to be searching within as far as how I will get qualified with ultimately the end servicer? So we created a scenario where we would basically do the role of what a lender would do in a pre-qualification. Now, we don't use qualification because we don't offer financing, but we will take in all the stuff we would take in if you were in a contract. We will look at you in the same light, and we will be able to say, you should be able to get approved for an assumption up to 500,000 or 600,000 with a gap, assuming you need to fill a gap of up to 50,000 or 100,000, right? And that is going to give you something that's a tool to go out and use in your hunting process, or go out and use when you're talking to a potential seller to say, hey, I've already started this process. We do charge our engagement fee, which is $50 to do that, but then you have paid it. So then if you find an assumption out there that you get involved in, you don't have to pay us again on the engagement fee, right? Because we charge $750 per side. So we charge $50 engagement, $700 at assumption approval. You would only then, once you're in the deal, owe us the remaining $700 if your assumption is approved and cleared to close. So our goal with that is simply to fill a market need for potential clients.
Yeah, and I can speak firsthand, having one of our clients actually do that recently and submit their paperwork to Craig and his company, and literally next day, he was like, well, no, sorry, you won't qualify for this assumption or this purchase price because you just missed your entitlement amount by this much, right? Because this person in particular had another property in a different state, so I mean, man, you saved us days, months of headaches potentially, because otherwise we would have found that out probably at the last hour before, we were going to close.
Yeah. Had we not been, obviously, if we were involved in the deal when it went under contract, you'd have lost maybe a few days, but we saved anybody from even going in a contract
Yep.
Without us, the entitlement issue, a lot of sellers and buyers would get caught because the servicer usually wouldn't check that until like right before closing. And that could have blown up that deal 3 months in. That's no fun. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
I will add one last thing. So you did mention, Craig, that lenders are hesitant, right, to really engage with you. Some are, yeah, exactly. Some, I agree. However, if you watched our other answer that we did about this topic with the new guidelines that the VA administration just put out, which we're not going to explain in this one. Watch the other Q&A we did on that. I do believe that more lenders are now going to be willing and be excited to talk to every buyer, because most of them are going to be now able to have a solution for you for secondary financing if you need to go in that direction.
All right. Well, thank you, Randy and Craig, for joining us for this Q&A.